Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today we are going to be doing a full style breakdown, specifically of myself. These are the kinds of videos that really, when I made the channel, I wanted to make from the beginning, but I didn't have very much confidence in my ability as an editor or anything like that, so I haven't done it yet. But now that I've pretty much run out of footage that other people are sending me, I'm breaking the glass a bit early, and I'm just going to make one of myself first as kind of a test case. So the way that these are going to work is that I'm going to outline a person's style in three particular ways. The first is going to be all about their zoofectin. And if you don't know what that means, it's the stuff you do before you are actually fighting. So they say fence and everything that happens before you start actually fighting, right up until you throw your first attack or you throw up your first parry. Things like how you stand, do you prefer to attack or defend, move forwards versus backwards, footwork, things like that. The second thing is going to be the particular person's favorite or exceptional techniques. So things that they do differently or better than anyone else or most other people, and why they use them in this particular way for themselves. You know, why does this set of Zvere Cows work for them? Why does this long point work for them? Stuff like that. This is going to be the closest thing to the other videos I make, where it's all about the specifics of a particular situation, a particular exchange, and why the technique being showcased was chosen. The last thing, and I think the most exciting thing, is going to be the fighting flowchart. So my personal belief is that every successful fighter, again, regardless of HEMA or otherwise, has something like a flowchart or a plan that they utilize in their fighting to be successful. I call it a flowchart because what I'm trying to avoid is painting a picture where a person is just the summation of their physical attributes and the particular techniques that they use, and put more of the emphasis on how those techniques and attributes come together to form a cohesive whole, and that, basically shows itself as the plan that they use during their fights. So the first example I'm going to look at here is zoofectin, and specifically everything that I do before an exchange really happens. And the first thing I want everyone to look at is the feet. Specifically, this very linear footwork that I'm using. If you ever see somebody fighting in this style, what it basically tells you is that they're going to be primarily focused on moving forward and backward towards their opponent and away from their opponent. It's a lot easier to do and have explosive forward momentum with this particular foot position. And it means that you're sacrificing a bit of your lateral motion, your side to side, in favor of explosivity, either going forward and backward. And you see that translate in these exchanges where every single time my opponent moves a little bit forward, I try to move an equidistant backwards and put up a parry. Every time I move a little bit forward, I try to sneak my way closer into range so that this big explosive movement will get me close enough to land a hit. And if they parry, I put my foot down and then I try to go backwards if I can. So the other thing to pay attention to here is also how much movement there is before the exchanges begin. So if you watch what's going on here, you'll notice that I am not really the aggressor. I'm not the one closing distance. I'm not the one throwing out the initial attacks. But I'm also not simply moving backwards and trying to invite my opponent forward. I'm throwing out feints, I'm doing motions, I'm throwing out sort of non-committal attacks that I expect my opponent to parry, and then waiting for a follow-up. And on the whole, what you would call this is a very defensive mindset. It's defensive in the sense that, if you would go back to the original text, for versus knock, I am constantly waiting for my opponent to do something that I think I can capitalize on. When they throw a tiny little strike that comes forward, I just take it on the guard and I wait to see what happens. I don't necessarily always throw in a follow-up. However, I also am not the one coming forward and throwing attacks, deep committed attacks over and over again. That is something that you see people do, but it is not something that I do. So what you can surmise here is that when you combine the linear footwork with this rather static, basic defensive mindset, what you're looking at is somebody who is going to wait for you to overcommit, try to use explosive footwork, either forwards or generally backwards, parry your overcommitted attack, and throw a follow-up. And all of these things are sort of contributing one to another. If you are always moving forward, what you're looking to do is you're looking to throw out that attack that the other person can't deal with. If you're always moving backwards, as I mostly do, what you're looking to do is wait for somebody to overcommit and then capitalize and punish their follow-up. So moving on to another example, what happens when the footwork and the zoofectin come together to form the complete, sort of setup? So if you watch this exchange, what you see is the exact same sort of footwork and I guess defensive mindset that you saw before. I'm not aggressing, I'm not moving forward, I'm not really moving backwards, but I'm constantly moving my hands around and looking for openings based on what my opponent does whenever I see them do something. And in this particular case, I throw a technique that is a favorite of mine, which is the high Shadowhow. So obviously, I am a very tall person. I'm 6'2". And one of the advantages that tall people have is that their shoulders are higher up than their opponent's shoulders. And what that means specifically is that when your shoulders are higher, they're directly in line with your opponent's head. So when you throw your Shadowhow, you don't have to have as much of a break in your wrists to get over the top of somebody's guard. If you look here, right at the point of impact, there's actually a downward angle from my shoulders to my wrists, and then an upward angle up from my sword to my opponent's head. But despite the fact that this really isn't a very level Shadowhow, it could be a little bit higher, the reality is that my opponent started off in a rather low guard, a plow, and as they came up to try to parry my attack, what they found is that they had to travel an unreasonable amount of distance just to get into a bind with me. And the reason for that is because when you combine my height with a Shadowhow, a technique that's designed to go up and over the top of a guard, you get a perfect little scenario where a Shadowhow from me can be a lot more effective than a Shadowhow from a lot of other people, specifically against someone who happens to be shorter than me, which again, because I'm so tall, is most people. So a Shadowhow is a technique that I utilize a lot, especially as an opening cut, because it not only forces my opponent into a situation where they have to overcommit to a parry just to stay safe, but it allows me to sit back and always use that Shadowhow as a bit of a threat to make sure that my opponents are always hesitant about entering my range prematurely without a plan of action. Because again, I'm taller and I have longer arms, my range is ever so slightly longer than most people's, which means my range at where I can hit you with this Shadowhow is a little bit longer. And if you're down there in that low guard and you're approaching, you have to be ready for it and you have to be waiting for it to happen, outside of a range that you're comfortable throwing a technique of your own. On this next example, we're going to see the Zvere Cow, which obviously if you look at my channel, you know I'm a big fan of. But specifically, we're going to talk about the setup here and as it relates to the zoofectin. So you see on the zoofectin, I'm doing something very similar where I'm just, rocking back and forth, I'm maintaining a distance, and I'm waiting for my opponent to do something that I feel like I can counter off of. And right here, I get what I'm looking for. My opponent throws a Shadowhow that they tried to roll over into a thrust. But again, being a taller person and being someone who can raise their arms up in the air pretty efficiently, despite the fact that my opponent has done a very good job of getting the overbind and, a good position where they could try to thrust over my guard, they're even a little bit off of the ground. I'm crouched low and my height is really paying dividends here. But the second I feel that sword hit my guard and not my head, I throw my first Zvere Cow. And one of the things I love specifically is the left Zvere Cow, particularly because regardless of whether or not it gets parried, as it does in this situation, it puts me in a very dominant position because in order to parry a Zvere Cow, anytime someone lands in your cross, they have to do one of two things. They have to get really, really close to you, or they have to put their sword in the way of your Zvere Cow. And in this particular case, in order to put the sword in the way of a left Zvere Cow, this is what you have to do. You have to dip your point and you have to cover that side of your body. And from here, I am in a position of dominance. My opponent has to commit all of their ability to hit me to not getting hit. And then in a follow-up, they will find that my second Zvere Cow can come out just as quickly as the first, and in their attempts to close, they will not reach me in time. So how does this relate to everything else? If you go back to the Zufectin argument, my ability and my stance lends itself well to forward and backward momentum and changes of direction. And so what that means is that when an opponent throws an attack that is either overcommitted or undercommitted or whatever, or is successfully parried, I have the ability to move myself forward and backward and put myself in the distance that I need to be to continually throw these Zvere Cows as I need to. In this particular case, I don't really go anywhere, but in other cases, you will see examples of going backwards very, very quickly to make sure that someone who's trying to close in on you can't quite reach you. So again, the tallness makes it so that when someone who thinks that they are throwing an attack that would normally hit someone who is a little bit shorter, they know that the second they're stuck up here, and as they try to close and take advantage of the fact that I have a slightly longer range, I can just, take my hands, pull them back, and throw pretty effective Zvere Cows underneath without much of a threat. Plus, because I'm taller and I have this distance management through my linear stance, I can know whether or not when someone hits my guard, how easily they're going to be able to close that distance and get to me. So you see here how far away this person is from me and how far they have to travel before they can get to the point where they can even think about stuffing my Zvere Cows. So the other technique that I believe is integral to my particular style is my offside thrust. And if you watch this particular exchange, you'll see how a lot of the Zufectin that we were talking about before lends itself to this particular idea. So normally, as usually happens, I'm a very defensive fighter. I rock back and forth, I maintain distance, and I wait for my opponent to attack me. But as so happens, every once in a while, I utilize this tool to prevent my opponent from haphazardly stepping into my range. So if you watch this, my opponent is walking in, and the second they move forward, I move forward. And this is something that up until now in this fight, I haven't been doing. So, and the second day I do, my opponent immediately recognizes that a thrust is coming. Why? Well, that's simple, because I'm standing here in plow with the thumb on top of the blade, which anyone who spars for a while will know is a key indicator that someone is going to try to stab you. So they step forward and they throw up their guard for what they think is going to be an onside, basically an onsets and stab. However, when that happens, I dip my point as I lunge forward underneath their hands, underneath their blade, right about here. And as I touch the other side of their crossguard, the side opposite of what they thought they were going to have to protect, I get my thrust in towards the face. And right after that happens, I start to push my hands up and forward to get into a cron parry that I know can keep me safe from a few of the instantaneous response targets that most people have. So why does this work? The first being that if we go all the way back to the linear footwork, you'll know that the lunge that you're seeing here is one that is perfectly suited to the footwork and the stance that I'm in. Because my feet are perfectly in line, every ounce of effort that I put into pushing off with my back foot is going straight into moving my front foot forward. And I can go very, very quickly forward and at a great distance, along with the extension of my arms, to cover a whole lot of space that many people don't necessarily they're just not quite ready for that level of commitment, especially, again, going back to the normal defensive mindset and defensive footwork that I utilize. So you want to catch people off guard with this. You want to throw what they think is going to be that instinctual first tempo stab straight to the face. And what you get is when you combine all of these elements, the sudden aggression, the explosive forward footwork, and then the threat of a stab in the stance that you have combined with this Dirtwechsel and a change through to the other side of the blade, you get a situation where you can very easily psychologically get people to commit harder than they intended to parrying their left side, only to find that the thrust is coming in on their right side. Then, as a follow-up, you take that forward momentum and you continue to move a little bit forward. You want to basically you're going to be fencing on one foot for a second as you try to pull your back foot back to a place where you can just get it under you. And in that time, you push your hands forward and you defend yourself from whatever countercut may or may not be coming at you. Some people, when they get stabbed, they commit everything to trying to stab and they end up, pushing their blade or your blade all the way out to the corner. And some people are a little bit more offensively minded. The second they feel that stab hit and they know that their parry has failed, they go for the afterblow. And you have to be ready for that. But in this particular case, that is a favorite technique of mine that I make work by mixing up the footwork and the typical defensive style that I have. And it catches a lot of people off guard. So for the final bit, how does this all tie together? So I'm going to be doing this over just raw footage of a fight I had with Stephen Chaney last year, and particularly because I wanted to point out how all of these things sort of blend. And right now you're seeing the exact same zoo effect that I talked about, linear movement, moving back and forth, basically waiting for my opponent to either overcommit, get too close, or, just make some kind of mistake and attempting to capitalize on it. You also see my rather timid probing strikes, which I throw sometimes just to try to force somebody to make a mistake, while also presenting the threat that I might throw some kind of attack. As I'll say in other videos, you have to be very careful about being defensive all the time because people will start throwing wacky stuff at you because they know you're going to try to parry. But as this exchange comes to its end and I throw my little probing strike, I go for something that I haven't talked about in the techniques, particularly because I don't think I do it particularly well. But in a sort of blending of the offside stab, I wait for my opponent to be moving forward, as you see they were doing right about here, right after I get them to basically take this little hop forward. I use that as a cue to try to attack in the hopes that my opponent maybe just committed their weight a little bit too far forward and they were going to have a problem moving backwards. They did not. And after I get them on their back foot, I try it again here, where you see that same little hop. And instead of throwing the thrust, I throw this left overhow towards the hands. And I manage to hit the hands just in time to have my head taken off. But the reason I point this out is because this is in itself its own little loop of the flowchart that I use when I'm fencing. I use my back and forth footwork. I use my linear style. I use my probing attacks to make sure that people stay honest and, wary of my threat. And the second I try to catch them moving a little bit out of time or a little bit too slowly or just with their weight not quite under them, I use that to seek an opening and try to get out of measure at the same time. In this particular case, I did not, but it stands to merit that that was what I was going for. In this second exchange, you'll see something similar. Back and forth footwork, but this time I get my opponent to commit to something that I can try to capitalize on. In this particular instance, I go for a right Zvere Cow. Probably should have gone for the left. But you see right here, as this attack comes out, how far away my opponent was from me. And in this particular instance, I threw the response that I thought I was going to be able to throw, where I would be able to land a hit. I don't actually think this was a hit, for the record, that was going to make it in time before my opponent had the ability to reach my arms. This typically works very well for me, particularly because I'm not used to fighting people who are actually taller than me and maybe have equal or even longer arms than me, but also because I threw a right Zverk instead of a left Zverk, which, as you'll know if you watch some of my other videos, is a lot more vulnerable to getting your hands pushed here. So that's how that exchange ends. I get pushed out of the ring. But in the next exchange, I believe this is another showcase of how I'm trying to keep my opponent honest by threatening a thrust going forward and to try to make sure that if they go for an attack similar to what they threw before, they're going to have to be wary of attacks like this hitting them as they're stepping. My opponent, again, does a little flat strike to the head, or at least according to the judges, and we go back. But now, thanks to that, my opponent is at least somewhat wary of the fact that I'm going to thrust at them. And you see on this immediate next exchange, rather than stepping forward, rather than coming at me and bringing the fight to me, you'll see that every time I make a little bit of a movement forward, I can get my opponent to start blocking. And this normally, psychologically, is a very good position to be in. And it's all because, again, when I got my opponent to overcommit to something, I got them to think about the fact that, oh, well, that thrust is coming on the next exchange or the next exchange, and I need to make sure that when I'm in range, I'm ready for that thrust to come at me. So this is another example of the classic Zvere Cow position. And in this case, I throw another right Zvere, but that's because we were already in a bind here. And this is a situation where both of us are starting to separate from one another. Our arms have detangled and we did not go for a grapple. And what that means is that in this instance, the first person, often the fastest person to throw a Zvere Cow, will win. Just in this particular case, we both had the exact same idea. We both threw a right Zvere Cow, hit more or less at the exact same time, which means that we both just sort of hit each other in the arm as we desperately tried not to get hit in the face. Another example there right at the end, where parrying a follow-up from this hanging position is often a really smart thing to do, even once you think you've landed an attack successfully. More probing attacks, thrust, just to keep my opponent honest. Waiting for that response, and in this particular case, I get the response that I wanted. So I've been throwing out these probing attacks. I'm waiting for my opponent to just sort of get a little bit out of position, and here's the one where I get it. So I wait for my opponent to take that step forward, and as they're taking it, I think more or less by accident, I get my thrust off, I get to throw my attack, and at this exact moment, rather than just stabbing me back, my opponent, who's been waiting for those probing attacks this entire time, opts to try to defend instead. And that's where I get them thinking that I'm going to throw an onside stab, and you watch my opponent's hands go ever so slightly, just for a few frames, up and to their left side. But those couple frames is all it took of, you know, picking the wrong side to land that thrust on the opposite side of their body. Now, the one thing I do wrong here is that I pull my hands back rather than pushing them forward. But if you would think about what would happen there, if I pushed my hands forward and raised them up, I might have been able to get my crossguard in the way of the hand shot that comes immediately after. But, you know, it doesn't really matter what happens in this exchange. This is all a culmination of my style trying to work as intended here, where my normal defensive mentality is giving way to some probing attacks. And the second I get my opponent in a mindset where they think, okay, it's going to be another probing attack, it's going to be another uncommitted thrust, I fully commit to the thrust on the offside, and I manage to get into a position where suddenly my forward momentum, my linear stance, all of these things come together to get me that one good exchange, which I get hit in the arms immediately after and lose some points like that. But this is all about breaking down the style. And in that case, what we see here is the complete loop of what goes through my head every single time I'm going into an exchange. Now, I would love to do more of these style breakdowns of other people. So if you want to submit footage for a style breakdown, one, give me lots of it, but two, I'd be happy to do it. And more importantly, hopefully everyone understands a bit more after watching this what goes into making a competitive fighter a complete fighter, in the sense that you have to make sure that you're not just a bundle of techniques. You're not just how you stand. You're not just what guard you like. You're all of those things put together, and the very intentional plan that you have to make all of those things support each other so that you can become a complete fighter yourself. That is going to be it for today. If you'd like to see your own style breakdown, you can send me footage over at HEMAFightBreakdowns@gmail.com, and I hope you liked the video.